My younger sister, Rachel, stole my identity to get a job interview at Morrison Tech Solutions. What she didn't know was that I was the anonymous hiring manager reviewing her application. And when she walked into that interview room pretending to be me, she was about to learn the most expensive lesson of her life about family loyalty and professional ethics. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came on a rainy Thursday evening while I was working late in my downtown Seattle apartment. I'd been reviewing quarterly performance reports for Morrison Tech when my phone lit up with Rachel's contact photo. That perfectly staged selfie from her graduation last spring where she looked polished, confident, and completely in control of her future. "Emma," she practically sang into the phone, using that overly sweet tone she reserved for moments when she was either celebrating something or needed a favor. You'll never guess what just happened. I leaned back in my desk chair, already feeling that familiar knot of apprehension that formed whenever Rachel called with exciting news. My younger sister had a talent for creating situations that somehow always left other people dealing with the consequences of her impulsive decisions. "What's going on, Rach?" "I got a job interview at Morrison Tech Solutions. Can you believe it? After months of applications and rejections, I finally landed an interview with one of the biggest tech companies in the city." Morrison Tech. My blood ran cold as I processed what she just said. The company where I worked remotely as a senior project manager under a pseudonym. The company where I'd been secretly building my career for the past 3 years while my family assumed I was still struggling as a freelance web designer. Morrison Tech. I managed to keep my voice neutral. That's great, Rachel. What position did you apply for?" "Senior marketing coordinator. It's perfect for my skill set, and the salary range is exactly what I need to finally move out of mom and dad's place and get my own apartment in the city." Senior marketing coordinator. I knew that position intimately because I'd helped write the job description. Morrison Tech had been looking for someone with at least 5 years of marketing experience, preferably in the tech industry, with a proven track record of successful campaign management and client relations. Rachel had graduated with a marketing degree 8 months ago and had been working part-time at a local boutique while living with her parents in suburban Bellevue. Her total marketing experience consisted of managing the boutique's Instagram account and helping with a few community college fundraising events during her studies. "Rachel, that's a senior-level position. Don't you think you might be aiming a little high for your first real marketing job?" The suggestion was met with immediate defensiveness. "Emma, I have plenty of qualifications for this role. My professor said I had natural marketing instincts, and I've been studying industry trends and best practices for months. Besides, sometimes you have to reach high to get anywhere in competitive fields." I could hear the rationalization in her voice, that tone she'd perfected since childhood when she was convincing herself that rules didn't apply to her or that her particular circumstances justified bending normal expectations. "How did you even hear about the position? Morrison Tech doesn't usually post their senior roles on general job boards." There was a slight pause before she answered. "I have my ways of finding opportunities. The important thing is that they were impressed enough with my application to schedule an interview for next Tuesday." Something about her evasiveness made me uneasy, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was bothering me beyond the obvious concern that she was applying for jobs she wasn't qualified for. "That's really exciting, Rach. I'm sure you'll do great." "Actually," she continued, and I could hear the shift in her tone that meant she was building up to ask for something, "I was hoping you might be able to help me prepare. You know how these corporate interviews can be tricky, and you've always been so good with professional stuff." The irony wasn't lost on me. Rachel was asking for interview advice for a position at the company where I'd been working successfully for years, at a company she had no idea I was connected to. "Of course I can help. What kind of preparation were you thinking?" "Maybe we could go through some practice questions, and I'd love your opinion on the portfolio I put together. I want to make sure I'm presenting my experience in the most compelling way possible." Her portfolio. I found myself genuinely curious about how she'd managed to create a compelling portfolio with 8 months of retail work and some college projects. I'd be happy to look at your materials. Why don't you email them to me tonight and we can talk through everything this weekend? After we hung up, I sat staring at my computer screen, trying to process the strange coincidence of my sister applying to my own company. Morrison Tech was large enough that there was no reason our paths would cross. I worked remotely with the development team, and she'd be interviewing for a marketing position in a completely different department. Still, something felt off about the whole situation. Rachel's confidence about landing an interview for a senior position, her vague answers about how she'd found the opportunity, and her eagerness to show me her portfolio all combined to create a nagging sense that there was more to this story than she was sharing.
Emma, thank you so much for agreeing to help. I'm attaching my portfolio and resume. I'm so excited about this opportunity. It feels like everything is finally coming together. The interview is scheduled for Tuesday at 2 p.m. with Sarah Mitchell in HR and someone from the development team whose name they didn't share yet. I can't wait for you to see what I've put together. Love you, Rachel. Sarah Mitchell. I knew Sarah well. We'd worked together on several cross-departmental projects over the past year, and the unnamed someone from the development team was almost certainly going to be me, operating under my professional pseudonym, Emma Chen Rodriguez. With trembling fingers, I opened Rachel's portfolio attachment. What I found was so shocking that I had to read through it 3 times before I could fully process what I was seeing. The first page was a professional resume under the name Rachel Elizabeth Morrison, which was accurate. But everything else on that resume was a carefully crafted web of lies, half-truths, and outright fraud. Under professional experience, Rachel had listed herself as a marketing consultant for 3 different companies over the past 2 years. I recognized all 3 names because they were companies I had worked with as a freelance web designer during my transition into tech. Companies where Rachel had never set foot. She described her role at Cascade Digital as lead marketing strategist, responsible for developing and implementing comprehensive digital marketing campaigns that increased client engagement by 150% and generated over $200,000 in new revenue. Cascade Digital was a small startup where I designed their website and basic marketing materials for $2,500 2 years ago. Rachel had visited their office exactly once, when she dropped off lunch for me during a particularly long work session. She'd spent maybe 20 minutes chatting with the founder about their business model. The second company, Emerald Bay Consulting, was even more egregious. Rachel claimed to have managed a portfolio of 15-plus clients with a combined annual budget of $500,000, specializing in social media strategy and brand development for emerging tech companies. I'd done a 3-month contract with Emerald Bay creating their entire digital presence from scratch. Rachel's only involvement had been helping me brainstorm color schemes for their logo one evening while we watched Netflix together. But the third entry was what made me realize the full scope of what Rachel had done. She'd listed herself as Senior Marketing Associate at Pinnacle Creative Solutions, claiming responsibility for developing award-winning marketing campaigns for Fortune 500 clients and managing cross-functional teams of up to 12 professionals. Pinnacle Creative Solutions was my own freelance business, the LLC I'd established 3 years ago to manage my independent consulting work before transitioning to my remote position at Morrison Tech. Rachel wasn't just embellishing her experience, she was claiming credit for my professional accomplishments under my own business name. The portfolio section was even more devastating. Page after page of marketing campaigns, social media strategies, website designs, and brand identity packages, all of which I had created myself over the past 3 years. She'd systematically appropriated every piece of work I'd ever done as a freelancer, presenting it as evidence of her own marketing expertise. She'd even included client testimonials praising Rachel's innovative approach to digital marketing and her ability to understand complex technical requirements and translate them into compelling marketing messages. Those testimonials had originally been written about my work, with my name carefully edited out and replaced with hers. The most shocking part was how professionally it all was presented. This wasn't a sloppy attempt to pad a thin resume. It was a comprehensive, sophisticated fraud that would be almost impossible to detect without intimate knowledge of the actual work and client relationships involved. Rachel had spent months carefully documenting my professional life, collecting my work samples, researching my client base, and crafting an alternate version of reality where she was the successful marketing professional and I was, still struggling as a freelance web designer apparently? My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. "Did you get a chance to look at my portfolio yet? I'm so nervous about the interview, but also really excited. This could be the opportunity that changes everything for me." I stared at the message, trying to process the magnitude of what my sister had done. She hadn't just lied on her resume or exaggerated her qualifications. She had systematically stolen my professional identity, my work samples, my client relationships, and my business reputation to create a fraudulent portfolio that positioned her as a senior marketing professional. And now she was going to walk into an interview at my company, present my work as her accomplishments, and potentially land a job entirely based on professional fraud. What made it worse was that she seemed to have no awareness of the ethical implications of what she had done. Her text message was full of genuine excitement and nervous energy, as if she'd legitimately earned this interview opportunity, rather than fabricating it through identity theft. I spent the next hour scrolling through every page of her portfolio, documenting each instance of stolen work and false claims. By the time I finished, I had identified 17 separate instances of professional fraud, ranging from claiming credit for my design work to inventing client relationships that had never involved her in any capacity. The scariest part was how convincing it all looked. If I hadn't been intimately familiar with every project, every client interaction, and every piece of creative work, I might have been impressed by Rachel's apparent qualifications. She'd done her research, understood the industry terminology, and presented everything in a way that demonstrated real knowledge of marketing principles and strategies. She'd essentially created a perfect professional persona based on my actual career, and then stepped into that persona as if it were her own authentic experience.
The question now was what to do about it. Rachel was scheduled to interview at my company in 5 days, planning to present my work as her own qualifications for a position she wasn't remotely qualified for. She'd committed professional fraud on a scale that could result in serious legal consequences if discovered. But more than that, she'd violated our relationship as sisters in a way that felt fundamentally different from typical sibling competition or jealousy. This wasn't about borrowing clothes without asking or competing for parental attention. This was about stealing my professional identity and using it to potentially take opportunities away from legitimately qualified candidates. As I sat in my apartment that night, staring out at the Seattle skyline and thinking about Tuesday's interview, I realized that Rachel was about to walk into the most educational experience of her life. She just didn't know it yet. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Friday morning brought a message that changed everything. Sarah Mitchell from HR had sent an urgent email marked confidential that made my coffee taste suddenly bitter. "Emma, we need to discuss the Rachel Morrison interview scheduled for Tuesday. During our preliminary background screening, some discrepancies have emerged regarding her listed references and work history. Could you join me for a call this afternoon? We may need to adjust our interview approach based on what I've discovered. Sarah." I stared at the email, realizing that Morrison Tech's thorough screening process was already uncovering the cracks in Rachel's fraudulent portfolio. Sarah was meticulous about vetting candidates, especially for senior positions, and she'd obviously found something that raised red flags. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was wrestling with the moral complexity of my sister's deception, Morrison Tech's standard procedures were independently revealing the problems with her application. I called Sarah at exactly 2 p.m., my heart racing with anticipation and dread. "Emma, thank you for making time. I need to walk you through what we've discovered about Rachel Morrison's background, and I have to say, it's unlike anything I've encountered in 15 years of recruiting. Sarah's voice carried a mixture of fascination and concern that immediately put me on edge. What kind of discrepancies are we talking about? Well, let's start with her references. She listed 3 professional references from companies where she claims to have held marketing positions over the past 2 years. When I called Cascade Digital, they had no record of employing anyone named Rachel Morrison in any capacity. The founder, Michael Chen, was confused about why someone would list his company on their resume. Michael Chen. I remembered him well. A brilliant entrepreneur who'd built Cascade Digital from nothing into a successful software consultancy. I'd worked with them during their early branding phase, helping establish their visual identity and digital presence. But here's where it gets interesting. When I described the work Rachel claims to have done for Cascade Digital, Michael immediately recognized the projects. He said they sounded exactly like campaigns developed by a freelance marketing consultant he'd worked with 2 years ago, someone named Emma Bennett. Emma Bennett, my freelance pseudonym, the professional name I'd used during my transition from web design into marketing strategy before I'd started using Emma Chen Rodriguez at Morrison Tech. My throat felt tight. Did he remember much about Emma Bennett's work? Oh, he remembered everything. Said she was one of the most talented marketing strategists he'd ever worked with, developed their entire digital presence from scratch, created campaigns that increased their client engagement by 180% and generated over $300,000 in new business within 6 months of implementation. The numbers Rachel had claimed in her portfolio, but significantly understated. Michael was describing my actual results, which had been even more successful than what Rachel had fabricated. Sarah, what did you find with the other references? Similar patterns across all 3 companies. Emerald Bay Consulting had no record of Rachel Morrison, but their CEO, Jennifer Walsh, immediately recognized the campaign descriptions. She said they matched work done by the same freelancer, Emma Bennett, during a consulting contract 18 months ago. I remembered Jennifer Walsh and the challenging project that had helped establish my reputation in the Seattle tech scene. She'd hired me to completely overhaul their brand strategy and develop marketing materials for their expansion into new markets. Jennifer was actually excited to hear about the work again. She said Emma Bennett had been instrumental in their most successful year ever, increased their client base by 250%, developed award-winning marketing materials, and created systems that were still driving growth 18 months later. And Pinnacle Creative Solutions? Sarah's pause was long enough that I knew she'd discovered something significant. Emma, that's where things get really complex. Pinnacle Creative Solutions is a legitimate business registered in Washington state, but it's not a consulting firm that employs marketing associates. It's a single-person LLC owned by someone named Emma Bennett, the same Emma Bennett who did the actual work Rachel is claiming credit for. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid Sarah could hear it through the phone.
There's something else, Emma. I tried to reach Emma Bennett directly to clarify the working relationship with Rachel. Pinnacle Creative Solutions lists a phone number and email address, but both seem to be inactive. The business appears to have ceased operations about 8 months ago, right around the time Rachel Morrison claims to have left her position there. What's your assessment of the situation? Sarah sighed deeply. Honestly, I think Rachel Morrison has committed significant resume fraud. The pattern across all 3 companies suggests she somehow gained access to detailed information about Emma Bennett's work and decided to claim credit for it. The level of detail in her portfolio is too accurate to be coincidental, but the complete absence of any record of her employment suggests systematic deception. The conversation was surreal. Sarah was describing my sister's crime while unknowingly talking to the actual victim of that crime. How do you want to handle Tuesday's interview? That's why I wanted to discuss this with you before we proceed. Normally, we'd simply cancel the interview and notify the candidate that their application contained inaccuracies. But the sophistication of this particular fraud makes me think we should document everything carefully before taking action. Sarah paused, and I could hear her typing in the background. I'm also curious about how she obtained such detailed information about Emma Bennett's work. The portfolio she submitted includes client testimonials, project specifications, and creative work that would have been confidential. That suggests either industrial espionage or some kind of personal relationship with Emma Bennett. Industrial espionage. If only Sarah knew how personal the relationship was. What kind of documentation are you thinking about? I'd like to proceed with the interview as scheduled, but approach it as an investigation rather than a genuine candidate evaluation. We'll ask specific questions about the project she's claiming credit for, request detailed explanations of her creative process, and see how she responds when pressed for information only the actual creator would know. The proposal made my stomach clench with anxiety and anticipation. Rachel would be walking into an interview designed to expose her deception with questions crafted specifically to reveal the gaps in her fraudulent claims. Do you think she realizes the risks of what she's done? That's what I can't figure out. The fraud is so comprehensive and well documented that it suggests significant planning and research. But it's also incredibly easy to verify once you start making phone calls. It's almost like she assumed no one would bother checking her references, or she genuinely believes her own fabricated version of events. After ending the call with Sarah, I spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended anticipation. Rachel texted me multiple times asking for interview advice, sharing her excitement about the opportunity, and expressing gratitude for my willingness to help her prepare. Saturday afternoon, she called with a specific request that made the situation even more surreal. Emma, I've been thinking about the interview questions they might ask, and I'm worried about explaining my transition from Pinnacle Creative Solutions to looking for new opportunities. Do you think 8 months between jobs looks bad on my resume? She was asking me to help her explain why she'd left my own business 8 months ago, a business she'd never worked for, and a timeline that coincided with my decision to close my freelance operations. Why did you leave Pinnacle? I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd rationalize this part of her fabricated history. Well, Emma Bennett, the owner, decided to scale back operations and focus on a smaller client base. It was a mutual decision that I should look for opportunities with larger organizations where I could have more impact and growth potential. The explanation was reasonable, professionally sound, and completely fictional. She had created a plausible narrative for leaving a job she'd never held at a company where she'd never worked. That sounds like a logical career progression, I managed to say. I'm just worried they might want to contact Emma Bennett directly for a reference. I explained that she's difficult to reach because she's focusing on personal projects now, but what if they insist on speaking with her? The question revealed Rachel's awareness that her deception had vulnerabilities, but also her assumption that those vulnerabilities could be managed through careful storytelling rather than honesty. Sunday evening brought a final twist that demonstrated just how deep Rachel's deception ran. She sent me a link to a LinkedIn profile she had created for Emma Bennett, marketing strategist and creative director. The profile was a masterpiece of fictional biography. It described Emma Bennett as a veteran marketing professional who'd spent 5 years building Pinnacle Creative Solutions before transitioning to advisory roles and selective consulting projects. The profile included endorsements from fictional colleagues, recommendations from imaginary clients, and a comprehensive work history that paralleled my actual career with just enough changes to seem like a different person. She had created an entire alternate identity for me, complete with professional relationships and career achievements that justified her claims about working for my company. If anyone tried to research Emma Bennett online, they'd find a credible LinkedIn profile that supported Rachel's version of events. The sophistication was breathtaking and terrifying. She hadn't just stolen my work. She'd created an entire fictional professional ecosystem to support her claims, complete with fake social media presence and manufactured references. As I prepared for Tuesday's interview, I realized Rachel had committed a crime that went far beyond resume fraud. She'd engaged in identity theft, created fraudulent business documentation, and fabricated an extensive digital presence to support her deceptions. And she was about to walk into an interview room where the person she'd victimized would be sitting across the table, armed with complete knowledge of her crimes and the authority to determine her professional future.
Tuesday morning, I received one final message from Rachel that crystallized everything about our relationship and the choice I was about to make. Emma, thank you so much for all your help preparing for this interview. I know I can count on my big sister to support me when it really matters. Wish me luck. I'm gonna walk into that room and show them exactly who Rachel Morrison really is.
Love you.
Show them exactly who Rachel Morrison really is. If only she knew how prophetic those words were about to become. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually energized me for important meetings. Instead, I felt like I was preparing for the most complicated professional encounter of my career. At 1:45 p.m., I would be sitting across from my sister in Morrison Tech's conference room, watching her present my stolen work as her qualifications while she remained completely unaware of my identity. I'd spent Monday evening crafting my approach with the precision I usually reserved for high-stakes client presentations. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, accountability, and protecting Morrison Tech from hiring someone based on fraudulent credentials. Sarah had briefed me on the interview strategy during our morning call. Emma, I want you to ask the technical questions about her claimed projects. You'll be able to identify immediately whether she understands the actual work involved or if she's just memorized surface-level descriptions. What's our legal position if we confirm the fraud? Morrison Tech takes resume fraud seriously, especially for senior positions. If she's misrepresented her qualifications to this degree, we'll document everything and likely report it to our legal team. Depending on the scope of the deception, there could be criminal implications for identity theft and business fraud. The weight of that statement settled over me. Rachel wasn't just risking embarrassment or job rejection. She was potentially facing legal consequences that could impact her career permanently. At 1:30 p.m., I made my way to conference room B, carrying a folder containing printed copies of Rachel's fraudulent portfolio alongside documentation of my actual work on each project she'd claimed. The irony of needing to prove my own professional accomplishments to expose my sister's lies wasn't lost on me. Sarah was already there, arranging documents and testing the video recording equipment Morrison Tech used for all senior-level interviews. Are you ready for this, Emma? I have to admit, in 15 years of recruiting, I've never encountered a situation quite like this one. As ready as anyone can be for confronting their sister about identity theft. Sarah paused, her pen hovering over her notepad. I'm sorry, what did you just say? The words had slipped out before I could stop them. I'd been so focused on the professional aspects of the situation that I'd momentarily forgotten Sarah didn't know about my family connection to the candidate. Sarah, I need to tell you something before Rachel arrives. Something that complicates this entire situation. I explained everything. My use of the Emma Bennett pseudonym during my freelance years, Rachel's systematic theft of my work and professional identity, the discovery of her fraudulent portfolio, and the realization that she was interviewing at my own company. Sarah listened with increasing amazement, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what I was describing. Emma, this is incredibly complex from a professional and personal standpoint. Are you comfortable proceeding with this interview? We could easily reschedule and have someone else handle the questioning. No, I need to be here. Rachel needs to understand the full scope of what she's done, and Morrison Tech needs to see exactly how sophisticated this fraud has become. Besides, who better to identify stolen work than the person who actually created it? At exactly 2 p.m., the receptionist knocked on our door. Miss Morrison is here for her interview? Send her in. My heart was pounding as the door opened and Rachel walked into the conference room. She looked polished and professional in a navy blue blazer and matching skirt, carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized as a graduation gift from our parents. Her smile was confident, her posture conveying exactly the kind of executive presence Morrison Tech valued in senior marketing positions. She was also completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Miss Morrison, thank you for coming in today. I'm Sarah Mitchell, HR Director, and this is Emma Chen Rodriguez from our development team. I watched Rachel's face as Sarah introduced me, looking for any flicker of recognition. There was none. The name Emma Chen Rodriguez meant nothing to her because she'd never bothered to learn about my professional life beyond what she could steal from it. It's wonderful to meet you both,
Rachel said, settling into her chair with practiced ease. I'm so excited about this opportunity with Morrison Tech. Everything I've read about your company culture and growth trajectory aligns perfectly with my career goals. Sarah began with standard opening questions about Rachel's interest in the position and her understanding of Morrison Tech's business model. Rachel's answers were articulate and well-researched, demonstrating genuine preparation and knowledge about the company. For a moment, I almost forgot about the fraud. Rachel was intelligent, personable, and clearly capable of professional communication. In different circumstances, she might have been a legitimate candidate for entry-level marketing positions. Then, Sarah transitioned to the questions we had planned. Rachel, let's discuss your portfolio in more detail. You've claimed credit for some impressive marketing campaigns over the past few years. Can you walk us through your creative process for the Cascade Digital rebrand?
Absolutely. The Cascade Digital project was one of my favorite challenges during my time at Pinnacle Creative Solutions. When I first met with Michael Chen, their founder, it was clear they needed a complete brand overhaul to support their expansion into enterprise markets. The existing brand identity was too playful for their target audience of Fortune 500 companies, so I developed a strategy focused on credibility, innovation, and technical expertise. The color palette shifted from bright blues and oranges to a more sophisticated navy and silver scheme, with typography that conveyed both approachability and authority. She was reciting my actual design rationale with impressive accuracy. I realized she'd done more than just steal my portfolio materials. She'd carefully studied my creative process and client communications to understand the strategic thinking behind each decision. That's interesting, I said, speaking for the first time since introductions. Can you explain why you chose Montserrat for the header font rather than something more traditional like Helvetica or Roboto? The question was designed to test whether Rachel understood typography beyond surface-level aesthetic choices. Montserrat had been specifically selected for its geometric precision and excellent readability at various sizes, factors crucial for Cascade Digital's needs across digital and print materials. Rachel hesitated for just a moment, barely perceptible, but I caught it. Montserrat offered the perfect balance of modern sophistication and technical precision. Its geometric structure reinforced the brand's focus on systematic, logical approaches to software development, while the subtle humanist elements kept it approachable for client-facing materials. The answer was technically correct and strategically sound. Rachel had obviously prepared for detailed questions about design choices. Sarah moved to the next test. Tell us about the social media strategy you developed for Emerald Bay Consulting. Your portfolio mentions a 300% engagement within 6 months. The Emerald Bay project required a completely different approach, Rachel began confidently. Jennifer Walsh needed to establish thought leadership in the competitive consulting market, so I developed a content strategy focused on sharing actionable business insights rather than just promoting their services. Again, accurate so far. But Sarah's follow-up question was designed to probe deeper. What specific metrics did you track to measure that 300% engagement increase? And how did you attribute engagement improvements to your strategy versus external factors? This time, Rachel's hesitation was more noticeable. I could see her mind working, trying to recall details from materials she'd studied rather than experiences she'd lived. We focused on meaningful interactions rather than just likes and shares, comments, direct messages, and most importantly, conversion from social media traffic to actual consultation requests. The answer was reasonable but generic. Someone who'd actually managed the campaign would have mentioned specific tools like Hootsuite Analytics, particular content categories that drove engagement, or the seasonal patterns we'd identified in their target audience's social media behavior. I decided to push further. What was your biggest challenge with the Emerald Bay campaign, and how did you solve it? The question was intentionally open-ended, designed to see if Rachel could discuss the complex client management issues that had made the Emerald Bay project particularly demanding. The biggest challenge was... she paused, thinking... The biggest challenge was balancing Jennifer's desire for immediate results with the long-term brand building that social media requires. Some clients expect overnight transformation, but sustainable engagement growth requires consistent, strategic content over time. Another reasonable but generic answer. The actual biggest challenge had been Jennifer's initial resistance to sharing proprietary business methodologies online, fearing that competitors would steal her approaches. It had taken weeks of careful negotiation to develop content that demonstrated thought leadership without revealing competitive advantages. Sarah and I exchanged glances. Rachel's answers were professionally appropriate and strategically sound, but they lacked the specific experiential details someone would naturally include when discussing their own work. "Let's talk about Pinnacle Creative Solutions," I said, leaning forward. "You described yourself as Senior Marketing Associate working directly with Emma Bennett. Can you tell us about your working relationship with her?" This was the moment I'd been anticipating most. How would Rachel describe her professional relationship with a person who didn't exist in the way she'd fabricated? "Emma was an incredible mentor and creative director," Rachel began, and I felt a strange sensation hearing my sister describe a fictional version of me. She taught me how to think strategically about brand identity, not just create materials that looked appealing. Her approach to understanding client psychology and market positioning really shaped my own methodology. The description was oddly touching, even though it was completely fabricated. Rachel was describing the kind of professional relationship she'd apparently wished we'd had, rather than the reality of our family dynamic. "What was the most important lesson Emma Bennett taught you?" Sarah asked. Rachel smiled genuinely for the first time during the interview. "She always said that great marketing isn't about convincing people to want something they don't need. It's about helping people understand how what they already need can be better fulfilled." That philosophy shaped every campaign we worked on together. I felt a chill run down my spine. That wasn't just a fabricated quote. It was something I actually said to Rachel 2 years ago during a conversation about ethical marketing practices. She'd been asking about my freelance work, and I'd shared some of my core professional philosophies. She'd taken real conversations we'd had as sisters and recontextualized them as part of a professional relationship that had never existed. The realization added another layer to the fraud that I hadn't anticipated. Rachel hadn't just stolen my work and identity, she'd stolen our personal conversations and reimagined them as part of a professional relationship that had never existed.
That's a sophisticated approach to marketing strategy, I said carefully. Can you give us a specific example of how that philosophy influenced a campaign you developed at Pinnacle? This question required Rachel to synthesize the philosophical approach she'd mentioned with concrete creative work she could claim credit for. It was the kind of integration that would be natural for someone who'd actually lived the experience, but challenging for someone reciting memorized information. Rachel looked confident as she began her answer, but I could see something shifting in her expression as she spoke, a growing awareness that the questions were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate with the surface-level knowledge she'd acquired. Well, for the Harrison Industries project, we could have easily focused on their cost savings compared to competitors, but Emma and I realized that their target customers weren't primarily motivated by price. They needed reassurance about quality and reliability. So we developed messaging around. As Rachel continued her detailed description of work I'd actually done for a client I'd never heard of, I realized she was now completely inventing projects to support her fabricated relationship with my fictional alter ego. The fraud had evolved in real time from identity theft to pure fiction. And she still had no idea who was sitting across the table from her. The interview had been progressing for 45 minutes, and I could see Rachel growing more uncomfortable with each increasingly specific question. What had started as confident answers backed by memorized information was evolving into creative storytelling, as she struggled to provide details that only someone who'd actually done the work would know. Sarah leaned back in her chair, signaling that we were moving into the final phase of our planned interrogation. Rachel, I'd like to discuss something that came up during our background verification process. We attempted to contact your references at the companies listed in your portfolio. For the first time since entering the room, Rachel's composure faltered visibly. A slight flush crept up her neck, and her hands tensed almost imperceptibly on the conference table. Of course, I hope they provided positive feedback about our work together. That's what's interesting, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining professional neutrality while delivering what I knew would be devastating information. Cascade Digital, Emerald Bay Consulting, and Pinnacle Creative Solutions all had some interesting responses when we asked about your employment history. Rachel's smile became more forced. What kind of responses? Well, let's start with Cascade Digital. Michael Chen was quite surprised to hear that someone named Rachel Morrison was claiming to have worked as their lead marketing strategist. He had no record of employing anyone by that name in any capacity. I watched my sister's face carefully, looking for signs of how she planned to handle this direct confrontation with her deceptions. Would she admit the fraud, attempt to explain it away, or double down on her fabricated story? That's very strange, she said slowly. I worked directly with Michael on multiple projects over an 8-month period. Perhaps there was some confusion about my official employment status versus contract work. She was choosing to double down, attempting to reframe her complete lack of involvement as an administrative misunderstanding. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's possible, though Michael was quite specific. He said the marketing work you've claimed credit for was actually done by a freelance consultant named Emma Bennett. He remembered the projects quite clearly because they were some of the most successful campaigns in Cascade Digital's history. Emma Bennett, Rachel repeated, and I could see her mind racing to find a plausible explanation. Yes, Emma was the creative director I worked under at Pinnacle Creative Solutions. Michael might be remembering her name because she was the primary point of contact for client communications, but I was heavily involved in the strategic development and execution. The lie came so smoothly that I wondered if Rachel had rehearsed this exact scenario, anticipating that her deception might be discovered and preparing explanations that could minimize the apparent fraud. Interesting, I said, speaking directly to Rachel for the first time in several minutes. Can you tell us more about your working relationship with Emma Bennett? You mentioned she was your creative director at Pinnacle, but our research suggests Pinnacle Creative Solutions was a single-person LLC, not a larger firm with multiple employees. Rachel's pause was longer this time. I could see her weighing her options. Admit the truth about never having worked for my business, or fabricate an even more elaborate story to explain the inconsistencies we'd uncovered. Pinnacle operated differently than traditional agencies, she said finally. Emma preferred to work with independent contractors and freelancers rather than maintaining a large permanent staff. I was technically a contractor, but we collaborated so closely that it felt like a traditional employee relationship. The explanation was creative and showed Rachel's intelligence, but it also dug her deeper into a web of lies that would become increasingly difficult to maintain. Sarah opened a folder and withdrew several printed documents. Rachel, these are client testimonials from your portfolio. They praise your innovative marketing strategies and creative vision, but when we contacted these clients directly, they all described working exclusively with Emma Bennett. None of them had any memory of interacting with you or being aware of your involvement in their projects. The documentation was spread across the table between us, testimonials that Rachel had carefully edited to replace my name with hers, alongside the original versions that clearly credited me as the sole consultant on each project. I think there might be some confusion about project roles and client communications, she said, but her voice was losing confidence. In many cases, Emma handled direct client contact while I focused on strategic development and creative execution behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, I repeated slowly. Rachel, can you walk us through your specific contributions to the Meridian Hotels campaign? Not the overall strategy, but your personal creative input and decision-making process.
This was the question I'd been building toward throughout the interview. The Meridian Hotels campaign was one of my most complex and successful projects, requiring months of market research, competitive analysis, and iterative creative development.
If Rachel had actually been involved in strategic development and creative execution, she should be able to discuss specific challenges, solutions, and creative choices with detailed knowledge. The Meridian project was fascinating, Rachel began confidently. We were tasked with repositioning their brand to appeal to business travelers while maintaining their family-friendly reputation. The challenge was developing messaging that spoke to both audiences without diluting the brand identity. So far, she was accurately describing the project parameters. But these details had been clearly outlined in the portfolio materials she'd stolen. How did you resolve the target audience conflict? I pressed. What specific strategies did you develop to address business travelers versus families? We created separate marketing tracks, different messaging for different platforms and customer touchpoints. LinkedIn and business publications focused on amenities like conference facilities and reliable Wi-Fi, while family-oriented channels emphasized activities and safety features. The answer was reasonable, but generic, the kind of high-level strategy any competent marketing professional might suggest. What was missing was the deep experiential knowledge someone would have from actually developing and implementing the campaign. That's interesting, Sarah interjected. Can you tell us about the research methodology you used to identify those audience preferences? What specific data sources informed your strategic decisions? This question required Rachel to discuss the extensive consumer research I'd conducted, including focus groups, surveys, competitor analysis, and demographic studies that had taken weeks to complete and analyze. Rachel hesitated, clearly struggling to provide specifics she couldn't have memorized from portfolio summaries. We conducted comprehensive market research, focus groups, surveys, competitor analysis. The data showed clear differences in what business travelers valued versus family vacation planners. Who conducted the focus groups? What were the sample sizes? How did you account for geographic and demographic variables in your research design? These questions required knowledge of research methodology and specific project details that no amount of portfolio study could have provided. I was asking for information that existed only in my memory and my confidential client files. The research was handled collaboratively between Emma and I. I focused more on the strategic applications of the data rather than the collection methodology. Sarah and I exchanged another meaningful glance. Rachel's answers were becoming increasingly evasive as she ran up against the limits of her stolen knowledge. Rachel, Sarah said gently, I need to ask you directly. Have you been entirely truthful about your work history and qualifications in your application materials? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was Rachel's opportunity to acknowledge her deceptions and potentially salvage some shred of professional integrity by admitting to the fraud. Rachel looked between Sarah and I, her expression cycling through confusion, calculation, and what might have been a flicker of recognition that her deception was completely exposed. I've been entirely truthful about my qualifications and contributions in my application materials, she said finally. If there's been some confusion about employment records or project credits, I'm happy to provide additional documentation to clarify my role in these campaigns. She was now claiming to possess documentation that I knew couldn't exist. Contracts for employment that had never happened, project files for work she'd never done, and email correspondence with clients she'd never met. The fraud had escalated from resume padding to what appeared to be preparation for document forgery. Sarah closed her folder and leaned forward. Rachel, I need to inform you that Morrison Tech takes application fraud very seriously. Based on our investigation, we have significant concerns about the accuracy of your claimed work history and qualifications. I don't understand, she said, though her voice suggested she understood perfectly. What specific concerns? We've been unable to verify your employment at any of the companies listed in your portfolio,
The clients you claim to have worked with have no record of interacting with you professionally, and the work you're taking credit for appears to have been done entirely by Emma Bennett, working independently as the sole owner of Pinnacle Creative Solutions. The weight of complete exposure settled over Rachel's face. For a moment, she looked like the little sister I remembered from childhood, caught in a lie that had grown too big to maintain, unsure whether to confess or continue fabricating explanations. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said weakly. "Emma Bennett and I worked very closely together. Perhaps the clients remember her name more clearly because she handled most of the direct communications." "Rachel," I said quietly, using her name for the first time during the interview, "Emma Bennett isn't someone you worked with. Emma Bennett is someone whose identity and professional work you have systematically stolen to create a fraudulent portfolio." The direct accusation seemed to shock her into silence. Rachel stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Confusion, recognition, fear, and something that might have been relief that the deception was finally over. "I think," Sarah said diplomatically, "we need to pause this interview while we discuss how to proceed with this situation." But I wasn't ready to pause. After watching my sister lie with increasing sophistication for almost an hour, I needed her to understand exactly who she'd been lying to. "Rachel," I said, my voice calm, but carrying an authority she'd never heard from me before, "do you know who Emma Bennett really is?"
She shook her head slowly, still staring at me with that confused expression. "Emma Bennett is the pseudonym I used during my freelance marketing career before joining Morrison Tech. You've spent months stealing my work, my client relationships, and my professional identity to create a fraudulent portfolio. And now you're sitting in an interview at my company trying to get hired based on my accomplishments while lying to my face about work that I actually did." The revelation hit Rachel like a physical blow. Her eyes widened as the full scope of the situation became clear. Not just that her fraud had been discovered, but that she'd been deceiving the very person she'd victimized in the victim's own workplace while asking for a job based on stolen credentials. "Emma?" she whispered, and for the first time since entering the conference room, she looked like my sister rather than a professional candidate. "Hello, Rachel," I said calmly. "We need to talk." The silence in conference room B stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. Rachel sat frozen, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen from her before. Shock, shame, fear, and something that looked like genuine devastation as the full scope of her situation became clear. Sarah cleared her throat diplomatically. "I think this might be a good time for me to step out and allow you two to have a private conversation. Emma, shall we reconvene in 15 minutes to discuss next steps?" I nodded, grateful for Sarah's professional discretion. As the door closed behind her, leaving Rachel and me alone in the conference room, I realized this was the first time in months that we'd been in the same space without the performance of family dinner pleasantries or casual sibling interaction. "Emma," she started, then stopped, seeming to realize that nothing she'd planned to say could possibly address the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, keeping my voice level and professional despite the personal nature of the situation. What do you mean by planning?" "Don't do that, Rachel. Don't pretend you don't understand the question. You've systematically stolen my professional identity, created fraudulent documentation, fabricated client relationships, and applied for jobs based on work you've never done. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding.
This was deliberate, comprehensive fraud. Rachel's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. I never meant for it to go this far. What did you mean for it to be? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked at me with confusion, as if she'd never considered what her intentions actually were, beyond the immediate goal of appearing successful. I was struggling, Emma. After graduation, I sent out hundreds of applications and got nothing but rejection letters. Entry-level positions wanted 3 years of experience, but how do you get experience if no one will hire you without experience? I recognized the frustration. It was a legitimate challenge facing many recent graduates, but it didn't explain the elaborate fraud she had constructed. So you decided to steal my career instead of building your own? I didn't think of it as stealing, Rachel said quickly. I thought of it as borrowing credibility until I could prove myself. I figured once I got hired somewhere based on the portfolio, I'd work hard and learn quickly enough that it wouldn't matter how I got the opportunity. The rationalization was breathtaking in its naivete and self-serving logic. Rachel, you claimed credit for $2.3 million in marketing campaigns and 3 years of professional experience you've never had. You created fake LinkedIn profiles, fabricated client testimonials, and just spent an hour lying to my colleagues about work I spent months completing. How exactly did you plan to learn quickly enough to perform at a senior level in a field where you have zero actual experience? I've been studying marketing theory and industry best practices for months. I know I can do the work if someone gives me a chance. Knowing marketing theory and actually executing successful campaigns are completely different skill sets. You can't fake expertise in client management, creative problem solving under pressure, and the 100 small decisions that separate successful marketing from expensive failures. Rachel was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't try to hide. I know that now, but when I started putting the portfolio together, I convinced myself that I understood the work well enough to grow into it. When you started putting the portfolio together, walk me through that process, Rachel. How did you decide to steal my professional identity instead of building your own credentials? It started small, Emma. I was at Mom and Dad's house, feeling terrible about another job rejection, and I saw some of your old project files from when you were working on the Cascade Digital rebrand. You'd left them in the living room when you came for dinner that night last spring. I remember that evening. I'd been excited about the project's success and had brought samples to show our parents, hoping they'd finally understand that my freelance career was more than just playing around with computer graphics. The work was so impressive, Emma. The strategic thinking, the creative execution, the measurable results. I kept thinking about how someone with those accomplishments would never have trouble finding opportunities.
Rachel's confession was revealing the methodical nature of her deception. This wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was a calculated campaign of identity theft that had required significant research and planning. How did you get access to my client files and communications? Your laptop, when you visited for family dinners. You always left it open while we were eating, and sometimes I'd look through your project folders while you were in the kitchen with Mom. I started taking photos of documents with my phone. The violation felt more personal than professional fraud. Rachel had been systematically spying on my work during family gatherings, turning my trust and openness into opportunities for theft. The LinkedIn profile for Emma Bennett, when did you create that? 2 months ago. I realized that if anyone tried to research the person I claimed to have worked for, they'd find nothing online, so I created a believable professional presence that would support my story. With fake endorsements and fabricated work history? Yes, the admission was quiet but clear. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the scope of planning and deception Rachel had engaged in. This wasn't desperate job searching. It was identity theft, business fraud, and systematic manipulation that could have resulted in serious legal consequences. Rachel, do you understand that what you've done could be prosecuted criminally? Identity theft, business fraud, creating false documents, these are serious crimes that could impact your ability to work in any professional field. I know, she whispered. I realized that this week when I started really thinking about what would happen if someone discovered the truth. But by then, I was already scheduled for the interview, and I didn't know how to back out without raising suspicions. You could have gotten sick. You could have had a family emergency. You could have been honest about your qualifications and asked to be considered for entry-level positions instead. I was afraid you'd find out if I canceled last minute and Morrison Tech contacted you as a reference for my real work experience. The circular logic was almost comical. Rachel had been afraid that backing out of fraud might expose her fraud, so she decided to proceed with fraud instead. What did you think was going to happen in this interview? Even if you'd managed to fool Sarah and me, what was your plan for actually doing the job? Senior marketing coordinators are expected to manage campaigns, lead client meetings, and produce results immediately. You can't fake competence in day-to-day professional responsibilities. I thought I could learn on the job. I've always been a quick learner, and I figured with my theoretical knowledge and some mentoring, I could grow into the role. Rachel, this position has a $120,000 salary and manages marketing budgets of over $500,000 annually. Morrison Tech would be trusting you with major client relationships and campaign strategies that directly impact our revenue. You can't grow into that level of responsibility while learning basic marketing skills. The numbers seemed to shock her into understanding the magnitude of what she'd been attempting. She'd been so focused on getting hired that she hadn't considered the actual expectations and pressures of the role she was seeking. I never thought about it that way, she said quietly. What way did you think about it? I thought about it as an opportunity to prove myself. I figured if I worked harder than anyone else and stayed late to learn what I needed to learn, I could justify the initial deception by delivering good results. And what about the other qualified candidates who didn't get interviews because you took a spot with fraudulent credentials? What about the legitimate marketing professionals who are competing honestly for positions while you're gaining unfair advantages through theft? The question seemed to be one Rachel had never considered. Her focus had been entirely on her own career prospects, without regard for how her actions might impact others in similar situations. I didn't think about other candidates, she admitted. Of course you didn't, because this entire scheme has been focused exclusively on what you want and what you need, without any consideration for professional ethics, legal boundaries, or how your actions affect other people. My voice was getting sharper as the full implications of Rachel's selfishness became clear. She'd committed serious crimes to gain unfair advantages in a competitive job market, potentially taking opportunities away from honest candidates while putting Morrison Tech at risk of making hiring decisions based on false information. Emma, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix what I've done, but I need you to know that I never intended to hurt you or anyone else. Rachel, good intentions don't mitigate criminal behavior. You didn't accidentally steal my identity. You systematically researched my clients, photographed my confidential files, created fraudulent documents, and lied to potential employers for months. The impact on me and on honest job seekers was entirely predictable. What happens now? She asked, though her voice suggested she was afraid to hear the answer. That depends on several factors. Morrison Tech's policies regarding application fraud, the potential legal implications of identity theft and document forgery, and whether you're willing to take responsibility for what you've done instead of continuing to minimize and rationalize it. A knock on the conference room door interrupted our conversation. Sarah returned, carrying a folder that I assumed contained Morrison Tech's procedures for handling discovered fraud. How are you both doing? Sarah asked diplomatically. Rachel has acknowledged that her application contained false information. We're discussing how to proceed. Sarah nodded and took her seat. Rachel, I need to inform you that Morrison Tech considers application fraud a serious matter with potential legal implications. However, our primary concern at this point is understanding the full scope of the misrepresentations and determining appropriate next steps. What does that mean exactly? She asked.
It means we need you to provide a complete, honest accounting of all false or misleading information in your application materials. We also need to understand whether you've applied to other companies using similar fraudulent credentials. The request for full disclosure was Rachel's opportunity to demonstrate some degree of integrity by being completely honest about her deceptions, even though doing so might increase the potential consequences she faced. I watched my sister's face as she weighed her options, wondering whether she would continue trying to minimize her crimes or finally accept full responsibility for what she'd done. Her next words would determine not just her professional future, but whether our relationship as sisters could survive the betrayal she'd committed. Rachel took a shaky breath and looked directly at Sarah, then at me. For the first time since entering the conference room, she seemed to understand that her only path forward was complete honesty, regardless of the consequences. "I need to tell you everything," she said quietly. "Not just about Morrison Tech, but about all of it." Sarah opened her notebook and activated the digital recorder Morrison Tech used for documenting serious HR issues. "Rachel, I want you to understand that anything you tell us may be used in our internal investigation and could potentially be shared with legal authorities if warranted. Do you want to consult with an attorney before proceeding?" "No," Rachel said immediately. "I've been lying for months and it's destroying me. I need to tell the truth, whatever the consequences are." I felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness watching my sister finally choose honesty over self-preservation. It was too late to undo the damage she'd caused, but at least she was finally acting with some integrity. "Start from the beginning," Sarah said gently. "When did you first decide to use false information in job applications?" 6 months ago. I had been unemployed since graduation, living with my parents, watching my college friends get hired for positions I felt equally qualified for. I was getting desperate and starting to panic about my career prospects. Rachel paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. "The breaking point was when Jennifer Walsh, she runs Emerald Bay Consulting, came to our house for dinner. My mom had met her at some networking event and invited her over because she thought Jennifer might have entry-level opportunities for me. I remembered that dinner. Our parents were excited about connecting Rachel with a successful businesswoman, and I'd been impressed by their proactive networking efforts on her behalf. Jennifer was polite, but it was obvious she wasn't interested in hiring someone with my limited experience. She kept asking about my practical marketing experience, and all I could talk about was class projects and theoretical knowledge." "What changed your approach?" Sarah asked. After Jennifer left, I was feeling completely defeated. I went up to my old bedroom and started scrolling through LinkedIn, looking at profiles of people who'd gotten hired for positions I'd then rejected from. I was trying to figure out what they had that I didn't. Rachel's voice was getting stronger as she settled into her confession. I could see the relief on her face at finally being able to tell the truth after months of maintaining elaborate lies. That's when I remembered Emma's project files from the Emerald Bay contract. She had shown them to our family a year earlier, explaining how she had helped develop their brand strategy and social media presence. The results were incredible, exactly the kind of measurable success that employers wanted to see. "So you decided to claim credit for Emma's work," Sarah said, making notes. "Not immediately. At first, I just thought about how those specific results could be used as examples in cover letters. Like, if I was applying for social media positions, I could mention that I'd seen campaigns generate 300% engagement increases, and employers might assume I'd been involved in creating those campaigns." The rationalization process Rachel was describing showed how gradually she'd convinced herself that increasingly serious deceptions were justified by her difficult job search. "When did you transition from mentioning results to claiming direct credit?" "About a month later. I was applying for a marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized tech company, and they asked for a portfolio of previous work.
I didn't have any professional portfolio pieces, just college assignments that looked amateur compared to what I was competing against. Rachel looked directly at me for the first time since beginning her confession. Emma, I'm sorry. I know this doesn't excuse what I did, but I felt like I had to choose between continued unemployment and bending the truth about my experience. Bending the truth, I repeated. Rachel, you created an entirely fictional work history. That's not bending the truth. That's comprehensive fraud. I know that now, but at the time I convinced myself that it was more like creative presentation of related experience. I told myself that I'd been exposed to high-level marketing work through family connections, so it wasn't completely fabricated. Sarah looked up from her notes. Tell us about the first application where you used Emma's work. Tech Solutions, a startup in Bellevue. They were looking for someone to manage their digital marketing, and I submitted a portfolio that included the Cascade Digital rebrand and the Meridian Hotels campaign. I presented them as collaborative projects I'd worked on through Pinnacle Creative Solutions. What happened with that application? They were impressed and brought me in for 3 rounds of interviews. I made it to the final round before they hired someone with more traditional agency experience. The revelation that Rachel had been using my work to get job interviews for months was infuriating, but also explained her growing confidence in the deception. She'd received positive feedback that reinforced her belief that the stolen portfolio was an effective strategy. How many companies have you applied to using Emma's work? Sarah asked. Rachel hesitated, clearly calculating whether to minimize the number or tell the complete truth.
17 companies over the past 4 months. Morrison Tech was going to be number 18. 17 companies. Rachel had committed identity theft and application fraud at a scale that went far beyond the desperate mistake she'd initially described. Did any of the other companies detect the fraudulent information? I asked. 2 of them asked follow-up questions that made me nervous. Highland Marketing wanted to speak directly with Emma Bennett about our working relationship, and I told them she was traveling internationally for an extended period. Pacific Northwest Digital asked for specific performance metrics that I couldn't provide, and I withdrew my application claiming I had accepted another position. What about the LinkedIn profile you created for Emma Bennett? Sarah asked. Walk us through that process. That was 3 months ago. I realized that if employers tried to research Emma Bennett online, they wouldn't find anything current. I needed to create a credible professional presence that would support my claims about working for Pinnacle Creative Solutions. How did you research Emma's background to make the profile convincing? Rachel looked uncomfortable again. I used information from Emma's real social media profiles, her college records, and details from her actual freelance contracts that I found on her laptop. You accessed Emma's private financial and client information without permission? Yes. Over several months, whenever she visited for family dinners or holidays, I would look through her project files and take photos of contracts, client correspondence, and creative briefs. The systematic violation of my privacy was more disturbing than the professional fraud. Rachel had spent months spying on my personal and business life, documenting my relationships and accomplishments to use for her own benefit. Did you create any other false documentation beyond the LinkedIn profile? Sarah asked. I created fake email addresses that looked like they could belong to Emma Bennett, and I drafted template responses in case anyone tried to contact her directly. I also modified some of Emma's actual client testimonials, changing the names and dates to make them look like they were written about my work instead. You committed document forgery in addition to identity theft, I said, my voice sharp with anger. Rachel, you could face federal charges for what you've done. I know. I've been researching the legal implications this week, and I understand how serious this is. But by the time I realized how far I'd gone, I felt trapped. Canceling interviews or withdrawing applications would have raised questions about why, and I was afraid the truth would come out anyway. Sarah closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. Rachel, I need to ask you directly,
Are there any other false or misleading claims in your application materials that we haven't discussed? Any other companies, qualifications, or experiences that you've misrepresented? No, everything else is accurate. My education, my part-time retail experience, my references from college professors, those are all real. The only fraud was related to claiming credit for Emma's marketing work and creating the fictional employment history at companies I never worked for. What about other aspects of your professional identity? Have you used Emma's work or reputation in networking situations, professional associations, or social media? Rachel looked genuinely confused by the question. No, nothing like that. I only used the stolen portfolio for job applications. I wasn't trying to build a career as Emma Bennett. I was trying to use her accomplishments to get hired as Rachel Morrison. The distinction she was making showed that Rachel still didn't fully understand the scope of professional identity theft she'd committed. Using someone else's work history to gain employment opportunities is exactly the kind of career building she claimed she hadn't been attempting. Rachel, I said, using my professional accomplishments to get job interviews is building a career based on my reputation. You've been competing for positions against candidates who are presenting their actual qualifications while you're presenting stolen credentials. That's not just fraud against employers, it's fraud against every honest job applicant in the market. I never thought about it that way. Of course you didn't, because you've been focused entirely on solving your own problems without considering how your actions impact other people. Sarah reopened her notebook. I need to document this completely. Rachel, can you provide me with a list of all 17 companies where you submitted fraudulent applications? Include dates, positions applied for, and the specific false claims made in each application. Yes, I kept records of all my applications in a spreadsheet. I can email you everything tonight. We'll also need you to provide copies of all false documentation you created, the fake LinkedIn profile, modified testimonials, and any other materials related to this fraud. I have everything saved on my computer. Should I delete the fake LinkedIn profile? No, Sarah said firmly. Don't modify or delete anything. We need to preserve all evidence while we determine how to proceed. The conversation was becoming increasingly formal and legal in tone, which seemed to be helping Rachel understand the gravity of her situation. She was no longer making excuses or trying to minimize her actions. She was responding to questions with the seriousness of someone who realized she might be facing criminal charges. What happens next? Morrison Tech will conduct a full investigation of your applications and the scope of fraud involved. We'll be consulting with our legal department about potential criminal referrals and civil liability issues. We'll also need to determine whether other companies should be notified about the fraudulent applications you've submitted. Will I be arrested? Sarah looked at me before answering. That decision will ultimately be made by law enforcement and prosecutors if we decide to pursue criminal charges. The scale of identity theft and document forgery you've described could warrant serious legal action. For the first time since her confession began, Rachel looked genuinely terrified. The abstract possibility of getting in trouble had become the concrete reality of potential criminal prosecution.
Emma, she said quietly, I know I have no right to ask for anything, but is there any way we can resolve this privately? I'll do whatever I need to do to make this right without involving criminal courts. The request put me in an impossible position. Rachel was my sister, and despite her betrayal, I didn't want to see her face criminal charges that could destroy her future. But she'd committed serious crimes that had professional and legal implications beyond our family relationship. Rachel, this isn't just between us anymore. You've defrauded multiple companies, stolen my professional identity, and potentially cost honest candidates job opportunities. The decision about criminal prosecution isn't mine alone to make. I understand, but if you have any influence over how Morrison Tech handles this, I'm begging you to consider that I've been completely honest with you today, and that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. I looked at my sister, scared, ashamed, and finally taking full responsibility for her actions.
The person sitting across from me was fundamentally different from the confident candidate who had walked into the interview room 2 hours earlier. The question was whether this transformation was genuine enough to warrant the second chance she was implicitly asking for. 3 days later, I sat in my apartment overlooking downtown Seattle, staring at 2 documents that would determine my sister's future. The first was Morrison Tech's formal incident report recommending criminal charges for identity theft, document forgery, and application fraud across multiple companies. The second was a personal letter Rachel had written to me, delivered through our parents, asking for forgiveness and the chance to make amends without destroying her life completely. Sarah had called that morning with an update on Morrison Tech's investigation. "Emma, our legal department has completed their review. The scope of Rachel's fraud across 17 companies constitutes a clear pattern of criminal behavior that exceeds our typical threshold for internal resolution. They're recommending we file reports with both local law enforcement and the FBI's white-collar crime division." What would that mean for Rachel? Realistically, federal identity theft charges, potential prison time, and a criminal record that would make it nearly impossible for her to work in any professional field. The sophistication and scale of her deception would likely result in prosecutors treating this as a serious felony rather than a misdemeanor mistake. The weight of that outcome settled heavily on my shoulders. Rachel had committed serious crimes that deserved consequences, but destroying her future seemed disproportionate to the actual harm caused. No companies had lost money hiring her because she'd never been hired. No clients had been damaged by incompetent work because she'd never performed the work. Her primary victim was me, and the damage to my reputation and career was minimal since the fraud had been discovered before any professional harm occurred. "Sarah, what alternatives does Morrison Tech have to criminal prosecution?" "Limited options, honestly. We could handle this as a civil matter, but that wouldn't address the criminal aspects of identity theft and document forgery. We could also refer the matter to professional licensing boards, but Rachel doesn't hold any professional licenses that could be revoked. What if Rachel agreed to specific conditions that address the harm she's caused and prevented future fraud? What kind of conditions?" I'd been thinking about this question since Tuesday's interview, trying to find a solution that balanced accountability with proportional consequences. Full restitution to companies that spent time and resources evaluating fraudulent applications, community service focused on career counseling for legitimate job seekers, a formal agreement never to use false credentials in professional applications, and maybe most importantly, using her experience to educate others about the consequences and detection methods for resume fraud. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "That's actually a thoughtful approach. It would require Rachel to take active responsibility for the harm she's caused rather than just accepting passive punishment. Would Morrison Tech consider that kind of resolution? I'd need to discuss it with our legal team and executive leadership. It's unconventional, but given your position as the primary victim and your professional reputation with the company, your preferences would carry significant weight in our decision-making process." After hanging up with Sarah, I drove to my parents' house in Bellevue for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my adult life. Rachel's fraud had devastated our family dynamics, but it had also forced us to confront deeper issues about honesty, accountability, and conditional love that had been festering for years. My parents were waiting in the living room, where Rachel had first stolen my project files months earlier. The irony of the location wasn't lost on any of us. "Emma, thank you for coming," my mother said, her voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "Rachel told us everything after the interview on Tuesday. We had no idea about any of this." My father looked older than I remembered, as if the revelation of his daughter's criminal behavior had aged him years in just 3 days. "Emma, we're horrified by what she's done, not just to you professionally, but to our family's trust and integrity." "Where is Rachel?" "Upstairs in her room," my mother said. "She's been there since Kiss Day night, barely eating, afraid to face you or discuss what happens next." "She should be afraid. What she's done could result in federal criminal charges." My parents exchanged glances that suggested they'd been discussing this possibility extensively since learning the truth about Rachel's job search methods. "Emma, We know Rachel has done something terrible that deserves consequences. But she's also our daughter, and we're hoping you might consider whether there's a way to handle this that doesn't destroy her future completely.
What are you asking me to do? We don't know, my mother admitted. We're just hoping that family relationships might allow for solutions that pure justice wouldn't. Before I could respond, Rachel appeared at the top of the staircase. She looked terrible, exhausted, scared, and genuinely remorseful in a way I'd never seen from her before. Emma, can we talk? We went to the back patio where we'd spent countless hours as children, sharing secrets and dreams that seemed impossibly innocent compared to our current situation. I wrote you a letter, Rachel said, handing me an envelope, but I wanted to tell you in person what I've realized over the past 3 days. I opened the letter while she spoke, reading her handwritten confession and apology while listening to her verbal explanation. I've been thinking about why I did this, really thinking, not just making excuses or trying to minimize it, and I realized that I've been competing with you my entire life without ever acknowledging it. The admission surprised me. Rachel had always seemed confident and self-assured, focused on her own goals rather than comparing herself to others. You were always the creative one, the independent one, the sister who followed her own path regardless of what other people thought. I envied that confidence, but instead of developing my own strengths, I tried to shortcut my way to your level of success. Rachel's self-awareness was more sophisticated than I'd expected, suggesting she'd done genuine reflection rather than just strategic planning for damage control. When I saw your professional accomplishments, I felt like I'd discovered a cheat code for my career problems. Instead of spending years building legitimate experience, I could just claim credit for work that had already proven successful. What do you understand now that you didn't understand then? That stealing your success didn't make me successful. It just made me a fraud. And that real professional accomplishment requires developing actual competence, not just appearing competent to people who don't know better. Rachel paused, looking out at the garden where we had played as children. I also understand that I victimized more people than just you. Every company that wasted time reviewing my fraudulent applications, every honest job candidate who might have gotten interviews I received based on stolen credentials, every employer who might have hired me and then discovered they'd been deceived about my qualifications. The acknowledgement of broader harm showed genuine understanding of the ethical implications, beyond just family betrayal. What do you think should happen to you, Rachel? I think I should face consequences that match the harm I've caused and that prevent me from making similar mistakes in the future. I don't know what those consequences should be, but I know they should be meaningful enough to demonstrate that this kind of fraud has serious ramifications. Are you prepared for criminal charges and a federal conviction? Rachel's face went pale, but she nodded. Yes, if that's what justice requires, yes. I've spent 3 days researching federal identity theft penalties, and I understand I could face prison time and permanent damage to my career prospects. I'm terrified, but I accept that I brought this on myself. Her willingness to accept severe consequences without begging for mercy showed a maturity I hadn't seen from Rachel before this crisis. There might be alternatives to criminal prosecution, I said carefully, but they would require you to take active responsibility for making amends rather than just accepting punishment. What kind of alternatives? I outlined the restorative justice approach I'd discussed with Sarah: restitution, community service, education, and formal commitments to honest professional conduct in the future. Would you be willing to spend the next year doing career counseling for job seekers, helping people develop legitimate portfolios and professional skills? Would you be willing to speak at colleges and professional organizations about resume fraud and its consequences? Yes, absolutely. I'd rather spend a year helping people build honest careers than spend months in prison for destroying mine through dishonesty. And you'd be willing to make financial restitution to companies that were harmed by your fraudulent applications? I don't have much money saved, but yes, I'll pay whatever restitution is required, even if it takes years. Rachel's willingness to accept accountability without trying to negotiate reduced consequences suggested her remorse was genuine rather than strategic. 2 weeks later, I stood in Morrison Tech's conference room again, this time for a very different kind of meeting. Sarah had arranged a restorative justice conference that included Rachel, representatives from 3 companies that had been most significantly impacted by her fraudulent applications, and a mediator who specialized in white-collar crime resolution. The process was unlike anything I'd experienced in corporate environments. Instead of focusing on punishment, the discussion centered on understanding harm, accepting responsibility, and developing meaningful ways for Rachel to repair the damage she'd caused. Rachel presented a comprehensive plan for making amends. She would provide 200 hours of volunteer career counseling through Seattle's Workforce Development Center. She would pay restitution totaling $3,500 to cover the time and resources companies had spent reviewing her fraudulent applications. She would complete a formal ethics training program and agree to ongoing monitoring of her job search activities for 2 years. Most significantly, she would develop and deliver presentations about resume fraud for college career centers and professional associations, using her experience as a cautionary tale to educate others about the temptations, methods, and consequences of application fraud. "I want to be clear," Rachel told the group, "this isn't just about avoiding criminal charges. It's about taking responsibility for what I've done and using my experience to prevent others from making similar mistakes." The company representatives were initially skeptical, but Rachel's detailed knowledge of fraud detection methods and genuine commitment to prevention eventually convinced them that her educational contributions could provide more value than criminal prosecution. 6 months later, I attended one of Rachel's presentations at the University of Washington's Career Services Department. Watching my sister describe her criminal behavior to a room full of college seniors was surreal, but also powerful. She didn't minimize her actions or make excuses. She simply explained what she'd done, why she'd done it, and what she'd learned about professional ethics and authentic career development. The hardest part, she told the students, wasn't getting caught or facing consequences. The hardest part was realizing I'd become someone I didn't respect. Success built on lies isn't actually success. It's just elaborate failure that hasn't been discovered yet. After the presentation, Rachel and I had coffee at the campus Starbucks where we'd met occasionally during her undergraduate years. "How do you feel about what you're doing now?" I asked. "Useful, finally. For the first time in my adult life, I'm contributing something valuable to other people's careers instead of just trying to steal success for myself." Rachel had been hired as a legitimate career counselor at a nonprofit organization that helped young professionals develop job search skills. Her understanding of what employers actually looked for, combined with her hard-earned knowledge of professional ethics, made her surprisingly effective at helping recent graduates avoid the pitfalls she'd fallen into. "Do you think we can rebuild our relationship as sisters?" The question I'd been avoiding for months. Rachel's fraud had damaged our family trust in ways that went beyond professional betrayal. But her genuine transformation over the past year had shown me a version of my sister I'd never seen before, humble, accountable, and focused on serving others rather than just advancing herself. "I think we're already rebuilding it," I said. "Different than it was before, but maybe more honest than it's ever been." Rachel smiled, and for the first time in years, it looked completely genuine. "Emma, thank you for giving me the chance to become someone worth being your sister again." As I walked back to my car that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since that devastating Tuesday when Rachel had walked into Morrison Tech's conference room planning to deceive her way into a job. She'd lost the opportunity she'd fraudulently pursued, but she'd gained something more valuable: genuine professional skills, ethical clarity, and the self-respect that comes from earning success rather than stealing it. Sometimes I realized the best lessons are the most expensive ones, and sometimes the sister you get after someone learns those lessons is better than the sister you had before.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.